Yo everybody, welcome to episode 8 of the This Week in Overwatch League podcast, the podcast where we go and highlight all of the most recent events going on in the Overwatch League. And today we're going to be focusing in on week 2 of the 2023 Summer Stage because wow, it was a doozy. Both East and West were absolutely insane, and it somehow one-upped what we got last weekend, which was pretty crazy in itself. I mean, there were just great matches and unexpected results all around. And just given the magnitude of what happened, I guess, Saturday in specific, I wanted to start out west as I usually do, because what the hell happened over there? Those games were just absurd. Rain and Outlaws, that game we're going to get to, but I actually wanted to start with Spitfire and Shock. This is the game that's been living rent-free in my head, because the Shock took a mean L. This game really wasn't that close. They took a mean 3-1 L. The Shock had zero answers for London's rush composition. London finally decided to stop being something that they're not, and they just looked way more comfortable and confident as a result. And the only thing I have to say is, what took them so long? I know that, the Reinhardt doesn't work nearly as good this year as it did last year. Dive's just the way to go. But when you know you're not a dive team, what's stopping you from just doing this anyway? You were playing the off-meta comp technically last year too, and look how well you did. You might as well just do what gives you the best shot to win, and I think the Spitfire realized that, especially after their super embarrassing loss to NYXL. I wish they did this sooner, but it's not too late to turn their season around, so better late than never. Just live and die by your Rhine comp, bro. If you lose, you lose, but at least you're giving yourself a better chance to win by playing this comp that you know you're good at. Sometimes you've just got to get a little creative to find a workaround to your issue, or in Hottie's case, play like an absolute giga chat on that Rhine, because this dude looked so amazing and fun to watch, I should say, on that Rhine. If you're London, with how your season's gone, with a chance to still technically be in the play-in race, just be unorthodox, be weird, and most importantly, I'd say be yourself. We've said this just over and over again with the Spitfire. This is just the answer. Whether it works or not, this is what you gotta do. This is what you gotta embrace. Embrace your inner Chad and don't pretend to be something that you're not. Sometimes this is what it takes to, surprisingly turn your season around and give you a new sense of life. Now, given the Shock clearly aren't improving as much as originally thought, and the Valiant also aren't that great of a team, maybe we could just suggest that these teams weren't prepared, specifically the Shock, but regardless, I think you still stick with this no matter what comes at you next. Just keep doing this against a lot of these other mid to low level teams, because odds are some of these other ones may not be ready for you either. Even with some film from last week, this is not exactly something that you've practiced or prepared a lot against. For a lot of these mid-tier teams, it may actually cause some pretty big problems. I mean, London are going all out here, right? They're embracing their identity super hard, and that in itself can really frustrate a team, as we saw at the Shock. I mean, the Spitfire were literally playing Rush on Watchpoint Gibraltar. When do we ever see that? Nobody does this. I mean, not even during GOATs. They still prefer to play Winston a lot of the time. It's just so bizarre to see this play out. It's so out of left field, especially with the Symmetra. You're TPing onto the high ground. Backbone's throwing blizzards up into the sky with his hands in the air like he just doesn't care. And Hottie's literally just in your backline, shattering in spawn, does not give a damn. And it's just something you're not going to see on this type of map. How are you supposed to be prepared for this if you're San Francisco, let alone some of these other good teams? Maybe a more coordinated team could handle it, but even then, maybe this was a surprise strat that most teams wouldn't have been ready for. I mean, the Shock were left so baffled that they literally had to turn off their brains to come up with some kind of solution. The Shock were playing just the most ridiculous things, really. Even after having all this time to process it, it's still so weird. They were playing freaking Bastion, Junkrat, and Pharah on, their attack. Not their defense, which, I mean, still is really weird given this map, but on their attack, they were playing this. And surprisingly, it worked pretty well, as it was actually the thing that kept them from being spawn camped most likely. The spam worked super effectively. But still, even though this strat, in a pinch worked out, realistically, this comp should never be a thing on Watchpoint Gibraltar. And you can argue that for both sides, not just the Shock. What the Spitfire were doing too is just something you'll never see. And these are perhaps some of the worst composition choices you could possibly make for a map with this much verticality. I mean, it is just such a big Winston map. It was super entertaining to watch it, I mean, don't get me wrong, but so brain-rotting compared to what you'd usually see in these scenarios. Like, it looked like something that you'd see in not even a ranked game, but a quick play game with, like, bronze players, These were some wacky comps. And the fact that the Shock ended up making their random damage line work and they ended up winning this map makes it all the more hilarious because their comp looked absolutely ridiculous. This is easily one of the most wild maps and goofiest maps of Overwatch we've ever seen in the history of its esport. It was so hard to watch, but you just couldn't turn away because it's so different compared to the norm, you feel me? Thankfully for London, though, they didn't really let this shake them up. I mean, they barely lost this map. It was like one fight territory in extra rounds, as you can see here. They lost 5-4. I mean, the golden box of victory was right there. But that ended up being all they would end up dropping, as they took care of business on push and rolled the Shock pretty hard once again. Overall, I'd argue the Shock weren't very prepared, and they just had no solutions for this. Like, it was a complete and utter booming from start to finish, really. Once they got absolutely destroyed on Antarctic Peninsula, you kind of had a feeling the series might be over right there and then. Like, it just didn't get any better. But on the bright side, if you're a Spitfire fan, this is pretty nice. Regardless of what comes next, and regardless of, how overrated the Shock may be still, and, beating the Valiant, this is a pretty huge week for you, and it might have just saved your season from inevitable doom. Going 2-0 this week has actually caught them back up, as you can see here in the Western standings. They're 4-8 at 11th place, and they are currently just 2 losses behind the Vancouver Titans to get that 10th and final play-in spot. If you don't know how the playoffs work, basically, seeds 1 through 3 get in automatically in the West. But then 4 through 10, 2 of them get to make it in through a play-in tournament. So Spitfire's playoff hopes definitely are not dead. It's still a long shot, but suddenly going 2-0 has them very much alive. Like, it's worth noting, Spitfire have a relatively doable schedule. I don't know if I can pull it up here. I mean, I could probably get it up. Hold on. I'll show you. I mean, like, it's really not bad at all. I'm pretty sure they play Vegas. Yeah, so they play Vegas. They're coming up. They play LA Gladiators, who are also in a pretty weird spot right now. Who knows how they're doing? They could be in a weakened state. So, realistically, they could go 2-0 again next week to propel them to 6 wins. And, depending on Vancouver, since they have some pretty tough games next week, London might end up in that 10 spot at the end of next week. It seems crazy to say that, just knowing that, like, I don't know, just a couple of weeks ago, they were dead in the water and it seemed like their season was over. It's really impressive, and I'm super happy for the Spitfire and their fans. The league's always more entertaining when those guys are playing well, I feel like, when they look confident and they're entertaining us. Like, London are really benefiting from the potential schedule change. Well, not even potential. The change of a schedule for a lot of these teams. Reorganizing stuff where the top teams tend to play more of the top teams, the bottom play more of the bottom. Spitfire might be one of the teams that benefit from this the most. It's opened up a pretty major opportunity for them. The only thing that's worth noting, though, is even though they're starting to play better, that they don't actually control their own destiny in this situation because of the hole they dug themselves into early. They don't really cross paths with any of these teams that are above them, like Vancouver, Toronto, New York, etc. They're not going to have a crack at any of these guys. They have Gladiators coming up, so that's one team, but Glads are one of the teams you trust to probably stay afloat and not fall into that bottom 3. So, you're more so looking at like Vancouver, Toronto, and most likely New York. I mean, maybe Shock, but New York, Toronto, and Vancouver, I think, are right there for the taking potentially. Those are the ones that you're going to be looking towards in terms of their schedules. And a lot of them, their schedules aren't very easy. A lot of these teams actually end up playing each other, and they have to play some of the top teams as well. They have it a bit rougher, and in some cases, a lot rougher than the London Spitfire. Like, Vancouver, like I said, they've got it pretty tough with a lot of these middling teams. But really, Defiant may be another solid way to get in there. It would be really depressing if this team ends up really mid again. But the fact of the matter is, their schedule's actually not very easy. We just saw them play Atlanta. Next week they play Houston. And that's on top of some other middling teams that they'll also have to go up against. They're not getting any of those freebies like we saw in the first half of the season with Valiant and Vegas. I don't think they get to play those guys again. And Spitfire also beat Toronto earlier this season. So technically, I think they do have a tiebreaker over them as well, so this could get really dicey if Defiant do not clutch up. They're lucky they beat Vancouver, let me say. If they lost to Vancouver, they'd be in big-time danger. It would be a major problem. But even so, they're okay right now. All these teams have a chance to keep Spitfire out of this. They're coming for them, but if they just stay afloat, get some wins here and there, they might just be okay. Spitfire, you have a chance. My Spitfire fans watching this video, just know that your chances are certainly still alive after going 2-0 last week. You don't control your own destiny, but all it really takes at this point is a little bit of help. Like, there's still a chance for you, a very good one at that. Because, in actuality, one of these teams may end up not doing too well with the brutal strength of schedule up ahead for them. Any one of them may end up on the short end of the stick and lose a lot of their upcoming games. So watch out for Spitfire. Definitely keep an eye on those guys because they're coming. Like, it's it's still a little bit off, but they're inching their way forward for sure. Speaking of chances, though, I think we should talk a bit more about the shock in the week that they had in particular. Because clearly, the changes maybe weren't as impactful as initially thought. It seems like these things aren't going to solve everything right away. Like, they go from beating Justice and Glads to almost losing to LA Valiant. Like, it was super, super close. Way too close for comfort. And then, like I said, they also got blown out by London Spitfire. Like, clearly, everything's not going to change overnight. It's going to take a lot of adjustments, and it's just a little concerning to me that they'd lose to London and then almost to Valiant, who are like two of the worst teams in the region. Like, it just felt like a completely different week. The tone felt a lot more like how we saw in the first half of the season. The supports in Junbin in particular, I just felt like we're not on the same page. Junbin oftentimes was going in and getting isolated in that London series, and sometimes the Valiant, and I just felt like he wasn't getting any help, I don't know where Proper was. I don't know where the supports were looking, but he was constantly just getting walled off, constantly getting focused. There was nothing there for him. He was trying his best to create space. Maybe he was a little too aggressive, but they got to figure something out there. There's some obvious miscommunication. They're not on the same page. And I kind of feel that way sometimes about Probe as well, as he definitely did get bullied at times. Like, I don't really know. Sometimes it really doesn't feel like they're playing as a unit. Maybe the strategy of pocketing Proper just didn't work as well for them this week. It was a lot easier to expose after watching some film. And because that initial plan wasn't working, Shock maybe didn't have a good way to pivot, I guess. It seems stupid to think about, but obviously they just weren't ready for what hit them. They were not in the right mindset compared to what we saw just 1 week prior. Maybe that high of making changes has worn off as well, because they just feel super disorganized again. They're trying to get used to each other. They don't quite understand how to cope with things that they're just not ready for yet. And that rush comp is like a primary example. It's something they've likely had not much practice against, if not any at all. And for a team trying to gel together, that can be really problematic, as you're probably just trying to get the basics down still. It just makes it especially hard to find solutions when these situations do occur. They got really frustrated when Winston and Ramatra weren't working, and they maybe got a little too creative with their solutions. Luckily, the Junk Bastion worked, like we talked about before, but the Orisa comps and then randomly bringing in Finn for that map with like Mei, Genji, Orisa, Zen was super wacky. Like, in theory, it's understandable because of what Discord Orb can do to Ryan, but it basically implied Shock had no idea what to do. They were being super desperate because, the comp that should work was not working for them. The Shock just did not have it together. Sparker and the guys were TPing all over the place, assassinating Finn and Probe. They just had no answer. And this kind of even goes into map 1 as well. Hadi basically had free real estate against those squishies with how deep he was going, just constantly charging into spawn, shattering randomly all the time. Dude did not give a damn, and the Shock had no clue what to do about it. I don't know what else to say, man. It's just a really tough week. I know last week they weren't super amazing, but to go from that to this is maybe a little worrying to me. To lose to one of the worst teams and almost to the other is a pretty scary decline, You'd just beaten 2 respectable teams consecutively, and now here you are with some notable consistency issues that have you questioning if they really are back or not. And I apologize for maybe overrating them after that good first week, because clearly they've got some work to do. They got figured out. The film showed some pretty obvious holes, and if London and the Valiant are able to identify those kinds of holes, what does that tell you about somebody who's actually better that's going to come up later down the line? Eventually, you're going to have to start playing good teams, and if you don't figure it out by then, you're going to get blown out. And also, think about what that might say about the Shock's easy schedule. Are they going to struggle against some of these other meh teams as well? If that's what's going to happen after being gifted this kind of schedule to get you back into the playoff race, then this season's a wash and you really don't deserve to be there. You can't be losing these kinds of games and then almost losing ones like we saw to Valiant. It's just unacceptable. You're playing hopes and, I'd say they're looking pretty good right now, but you don't want to go into those looking so flat-footed, If you're limping to the finish line, then you're just going to get knocked out super early. You're not going to make playoffs, and your season's going to be a massive disappointment. You've got to try and fix these problems super fast. Stop leaving Proper out there to fend for himself, really. I shouldn't even say to fend off the Wolves, to just fend for himself. This guy was dominating all weekend long. Literally from start to finish, he was popping off every single map. He was doing as much work as you could possibly do for a guy in a solo mission, and it still was not good enough a lot of the time. Stop giving all of your big-time issues to your superstar like this, stop getting him so frustrated. It feels like LeBron James in the 2018 Cavaliers. Dear God, man, just a lick of help, just a lick of consistency. This guy's still one of the best players in the game, and it feels like he's left to just go out there and die, with the efforts being in vain, basically. And I apologize greatly for maybe exaggerating their improvement. That's on me. But you just got to shake off this bad week and get back to the drawing board. The Shock are most certainly a team to worry about, and I think they still can turn it around, and we have to monitor their progress carefully. But right now, they're far from out of the woods, and I'm curious to see where they go next. I think that basically sums up my thoughts on Valiant Shock, though. Or not Valiant Shock, Shock Spitfire. So I suppose it's time to move into the Reign and Outlaws series, because this is also the big storyline of the week. The Reign finally lost a game after 3 months, basically. They finally took their first L after winning all of those games in a row in the regular season. They won 10 in a row, whatever it was, plus the 3 games that they won, I believe it was, in the midseason madness as well. They've been so dominant this year. They've rarely been pushed. But the Outlaws, they finally did what they needed to do. This was something I was really hoping they could show us. They could, finally overcome their big rival, their worthy adversary, and take that final step to show me that they are worthy of winning a championship this year. And that's exactly what they did here. The Outlaws practiced really, really, really hard for this one. They were sick and tired of losing to the Atlanta Reign, and they also knew they had to show up after a really bad week against Boston and Florida, and they went out there and just played their hearts out. Their determination was greater than the Atlanta Reign. They've been knocking on the door for so long, and they finally kicked it down. They took advantage of their better flexibility in this series, and I wouldn't say ran away with it, but, they did enough. They were the stronger rush team, and I think that is the big theme that allowed for them to win this game, because that's kind of the difference maker on Lijiang and Oasis as well. That's the opening that they were able to get. You know, they were able to keep up and dive in certain scenarios, but, you know, they lost 2 out of 3 of the main dive maps. But again, that difference is they were able to play really good on the more rush-centric control maps that the Atlanta Reign just aren't as strong on, it would seem. Outlaws, surprisingly, were the more flexible team and the stronger rush team. And they even tried shaking things up with the Junker Queen a couple of times. It had some mixed success, but still, it was worth throwing that out there just to shake up Atlanta Reign a little bit. I appreciated the efforts, even if the results weren't always super consistent. Like, Reign looked completely out of their comfort zone. I gotta admit that. That's probably the first time I've really seen that where you had to truly be worried about them, even though they still nearly won this game. This was like the first time where it's like, damn, they actually look human, you know? The Reign are going to be the better dive team, like 90 to 99% of the time, but it's not something they can play whenever they want to right now. And you're really testing them if you're making them play something else, if you're making them play your game instead. And it can be enough, as shown here. Even if you know you're going to lose some of these other maps, if you just do enough to get by and you frustrate them and you test their resilience and their patience, then hey, you found your opening. And the Outlaws were super locked in for this one. They played a really, really good game, and they deserve a lot of credit. A lot of people are saying that the Reign choked this one, and maybe you can make an argument for that, blah, blah, blah. But in actuality, the Outlaws just played super well, and I want to give them credit. The clutches from Shu in this game were, like, some of the best I've ever seen. He was playing with a chip on his shoulder from start to finish in this one. He was tired of hearing all of this fielder is better than him nonsense, so he went out there and he outplayed them with possibly his best performance of this year. Like, really. It was that good with how his Ana was looking, the aggressive nades, and his Baptiste as well was definitely a lot more impactful than Fielder's. The Outlaws were able to bounce back from a garbage week, and they came in prepared, and that's all there really is to it. Give them credit for getting this W. It's really big for them moving forward, and it just might be the thing that, you know, helps them take that final step and win a championship in the fall. As for Atlanta Reign, what does this mean for them? Was this just a slip-up? Did they just lose to a better team? Hard to say for certain, but the question now becomes, does this mean they're actually going to be beatable, like for more than just the Houston Outlaws? I mean, at least for Houston, I think it's probably going to be a 50-50 depending on what the meta is later on, but some people are saying that a lot of other teams are just going to be able to beat them now just by studying what happened here, and maybe to a certain extent that can be true, but we all know it's never going to be that easy. Because Atlanta Reign are literally just a group of god gamers. They're not some ordinary team. It's always going to be doable in theory, but it's not that simple, even if you're like Florida or Boston, you know? Atlanta Reign are just so great. They have elite players, some of the legends of the game, and we're kind of discrediting the fact that they might be able to adjust. We saw what happened after they lost to Gladiators in Pro-Am. They ripped off like 13 wins in a row, you feel me? Like, they're going to figure it out. Gator's going to step in and, you know, maybe help them find that solution they're looking for. Reign will maybe practice their rush more, maybe put Hawk in a bit more for the control maps, or perhaps they'll just ditch it all together and embrace the dive fully, and maybe that'll work. And maybe also there were some nerves going on as well. I think that's something that we have to remember. Like, obviously, this team has shown they can handle pressure with how they played in Midseason Madness, as well as just all of the dominant wins so far this year. But eventually that pressure starts to add up, knowing everybody's, you know, has their aim right on your back. You've got a big target on your back, and you're worrying about going undefeated. You could be the first team to ever do that, to have an undefeated regular season. That can make you overthink things just a little bit of hesitation, one bad decision, and then that's all it takes to lose to a team as good as the Houston Outlaws. They will capitalize on that 10 times out of 10. I think nerves maybe got to them a little bit. I think maybe, you know, now that they have that pressure off of their shoulders finally, and they have a chance to look at the film and change up the strategy a little, that they'll probably be okay. And honestly, they might be able to go 2-0 next week, even though they play Florida and Boston. I would not be surprised. With this loss, though, it's worth noting that in terms of OWL history, that they're going to come up just short of the Shock's record for most consecutive wins ever. And with this possibly being the last year of OWL, it looks like that's going to be a record that stands for the rest of time, so congrats there, Shock fans. Getting back on topic though, I think Atlanta definitely could be beaten by other teams. Like Florida Mayhem in particular, I think are a pretty intriguing matchup. I think with the correct map pool, like we saw in that Houston series, Florida could play exactly the same with their execution, if not even a little bit better on these control maps, as they're really flexible, but also really scrappy. The Mayhem don't go away super easily, it feels like. And, if the maps go their way, I think there is a world where the Mayhem could defeat Atlanta, even though it might be close, which could really shake up the top of the Western standings and the playoff race as we head towards the playoffs in a couple of months. Watching how Atlanta respond to this type of loss, and, how they respond to what opponents may or may not know about them moving forward will be super interesting. And with a big week ahead of them, Atlanta Reign are definitely a team you want to be paying attention to heading into week 3 of the summer stage. But on that note, we're going to move on to the other banger game of Saturday in the West, the Boston Uprising versus the Florida Mayhem. Damn, this was a bad day for ATP, by the way. I got all 3 of the Western games wrong with my Preds. Sucks to suck, I guess. But this was as close as it gets. Boston tried their best. They almost got their revenge, continued their improvement arc like they did against Houston 1 week prior, but they came up just short because Florida are the scrappier team. They were able to handle that pressure more, and their execution was definitely better. And ultimately, they used their better flexibility on control maps, just like with Houston, to get this win. This is becoming a very prevalent theme in this current meta/summer stage. Their rush comps were just a lot more refined. Anytime Boston even attempted to match them on it, they got absolutely wiped. Like, especially on Lijiang, Florida were sometimes winning fights literally within seconds of them starting. Boston could not compete. Not on the Reinhardt, and not on the Ramatra either. This is when Florida's quirkiness and flexibility really comes in handy. Sometimes they overdo it, but for scenarios like this, that flexibility factor can be so huge if the map pools go your way. And here it most certainly did with Antarctic Peninsula and Lijiang Tower. It just lined up beautifully with what they're good at. And since their dive is also relatively solid, they basically stood a chance on every single map, and Boston just don't have that same luxury. I was hoping maybe they had improved after watching what they did 1 week prior, but that just wasn't the case. I mean, they even tried desperation swapping onto like Ball Farah to find an answer, and it just wasn't good enough. The Mayhem were a lot more flexible and a lot more clutch. And that's the big issue that Boston seemed to always face this year. The Mayhem are really scrappy. They don't give up, they don't go away, and they constantly apply pressure right back. They can hit you, but they always find a way to hit you even harder. They are a super hungry group. They're looking to win. They're looking to punch their ticket to the grand finals. And that final fight on Lijiang, where the point flipped like 3 times, is the perfect example of it. Every time it seemed like Boston were in the driver's seat, Florida went right back at them. They're just a high energy team who love the pressure. Meanwhile, Boston always seemed to fall short when pushed to their limits, which is a little surprising just knowing who's on this team, but that's kind of how it's been this year. When it comes to that game point execution, they usually flop way more than, you'd expect them to. Their playmakers seem to disappear while the Mayhems thrive. Just think back to that Lijiang game. Like, there were 3 fights in a row on that final point where Checkmate was taking Decay out of the fight super early, like just completely by surprise. Florida's players react a lot better in the face of these moments, and ultimately that's what now has them in the conversation for top 3, maybe even top 2 or 1 in the league without a shadow of a doubt. They are well on their way to making the playoffs with this kind of win, and they've shown they're not afraid of anybody in this league, which could have the Atlanta Reign shaking in their boots if they're not prepared. They have all of the tools to make something special happen, and now all they really have to do is finish the job. As for the Boston Uprising here, even though it's a tough loss, and I have criticisms about how they play in the clutch and how they handle scrappy teams, you can't be too mad about this performance. I have a lot of questions about those jitters and that mental fortitude, but just pushing the Mayhem so much harder than last time is super awesome. Their performances against them and the Outlaws are a good sign of progress that maybe a coaching change was exactly what they needed. If they can work out the last remaining issues that are opposing them, there's a world where they could take the final step. It's pretty disappointing to see them lose here, but it's still a lesson that can help them grow, I feel like. And they're making that meaningful progress, and they have a chance to do so yet again against Atlanta Reign. So Boston, they're not in the worst shape. They just have to take those last couple of steps like we've seen with Mayhem and the Outlaws in recent memory. They can't get left behind. But aside from that, I think that's pretty much my closing thoughts on the West and how the games went. Everything else I feel like was relatively standard. Boston and Toronto was a little close for comfort, but Boston handled it. Outlaws New York, not too much to say there. The Mayhem NYXL game was kind of intriguing. New York definitely pushed the Mayhem pretty hard, so something to keep note of moving forward with NYXL and their play-in hopes. And then Toronto, there was that one map on Circuit where like both teams completed the map both times. It gave me flashbacks to Valiant Dallas in like season 1 Junkertown. Like, who wins 7-6 on Circuit Royale? Absolutely insane stuff. But yeah, aside from that, I think I'm ready to move on to the Eastern Conference, because they too once again had some pretty ridiculous results. Particularly speaking, the Guangzhou Charge is where I want to start off with them. It's one thing to lose to Seoul Infernal. It's like, whatever. You'd expect to lose to them, but oh my goodness, to get 3-2'd by Panthera of all teams is not a very good look for this franchise. It's super, super sad, if anything. Like, this is not a team you should ever be losing to. I know Panthera have some decent players, and they've shown some decent results so far this stage, but they're one of the worst teams, I feel like, on paper, not just for contenders, but in general in the East right now. So losing to them is super, super embarrassing. And it's obvious from all of this that there's a big conclusion that we've continuously been able to draw with this Charge team throughout this whole year. They cannot play Sombra. It is all we've literally talked about. If you struggle to play that Sombra Tracer dive, you're never going to compete at a top or even mid-tier level, as you see with a Panthera game like this. Even some of the weaker teams suddenly become a big challenge when they shouldn't be, because you cannot execute or excel on a comp that you need to win right now, especially in the East. They play a ton of dive in the East, even more than the West. Sombra is like the meta-defining hero right now. You are not going to win if you never play her at all. Avoiding her can only get you so far, and truly that has been the Charge's biggest problem this year. That's had them take big L's to a lot of opponents that have overshadowed them. It's costed them more than a few games this season, and you can just only play Jimmy on his hit scan and comfort pick so much. It only works to a certain extent. Like, to be fair, Jimmy has looked good on those heroes, and his Tracer also had some surprising bright spots, but just, being honest with ourselves here, you want Choi on that role because he's the hyper carry of this team and one of the best flex DPS in the game. You're just taking away from your potential even more in a way. Even though Choi is good on other heroes, Tracer is what he excels at. That's something that you want him to play in a Tracer-centric meta. Like, if you're going to play Jimmy on the Tracer, quit playing Choi on Echo so much and maybe just try the Sombra if you're going to be that stubborn. You might look bad, but you might as well try at this point with how things are going for you right now. To be fair to the Charge, they did play a little bit of Sombra in that Panthera series, like on Numbani and I think Busan as well, if my memory does not fail me. But they weren't playing it consistently, and clearly they're super out of practice. They don't look very comfortable on it. And that's a major problem that they need to fix in these coming weeks if they want to turn their season around and not have Choice A1 miss out on the play-ins and playoffs in a regional setting, or a global setting, I should say, for the third straight season, as his career continues to be super, super sad. Like, you gotta do this, man. Do this for Choi. Do this for Charge fans. Wake up and figure this out. And I guess that's not even only their only problem right now. Obviously, Sombra's like the big thing, but since Gaga, he just came onto the team, is still kind of new, maybe things could also get a little bit better with time as he gets more accustomed to his team and being in the Overwatch League again. Like, you could probably start to be more comfortable and squeak out wins like this against Panthera, who they barely lost to, mind you. But there's only so many excuses that you can give when he's literally playing with all guys he was with on Chengdu aside from Choi. and the simple fact that this play is not going to be nearly good enough to beat a team like Dallas or Soul Infernal right now. There's obviously just a big fundamental issue going on, and it's because of that frustration that's constantly building that they find themselves losing 5 of their last 6 games with potentially no end in sight for them. And when I say a fundamental issue, by the way, it's because there's actually some contributing factors potentially behind the scenes that may actually help explain some things. We're going to move over to that right now. It has to do with Piggy, who kind of reacted to getting dumped by the charge, and it ended up getting translated and moved into Reddit. And I wanted to take a look at this because it's a good indicator of why things may be going so sour for the charge, and it provides a lot of really good insight. I'll leave a link to this in the description if you want to check it out for yourself, but we're going to kind of go down the list super quick. So first thing to note is that Piggy says he got kicked out suddenly. He was notified the day of when the charge made that announcement, and Piggy apparently wanted to leave the team anyway. He's really good at reading the room, so to speak. After knowing what happened with Houston, it felt the same exact way. And, he kind of knew he was going to get kicked. He had a feeling. And the question became, why did they want him to leave? And in his opinion, it's because he sucked. They were losing all of their scrims, and he just didn't want to play anymore. And his expression was really bad, apparently, in the Hangzhou game. And as a result, he's kind of questioning if he even wants to play Overwatch anymore. There's a chance he could go to a different team, but that's only if he gets a good offer from a good team. Like, he'd love to maybe go to Infernal, Hangzhou, or I think the Outlaws, mostly because he wants to get carried. He's tired of playing Winston, which is understandable. That's kind of not what he signed up for in a way, but that's kind of how things are going with balance patches. He just doesn't want to be a main tank anymore. He'd rather be the off tank that comes in for very specific scenarios. Doesn't look like that's going to happen, though. There's a good chance he could be moving on to military service, and this could be the last that we've seen of Piggy. But more on the lines of what happened with the charge, though, he wasn't really sure if he could be good at Winston for them. He just can't carry. He's more of a team player, and that the charge need a carry. They need someone aside from Choice A1 to bear that burden. And as a result, he thinks that's kind of a big reason why he got cut from Guangzhou. But aside from that, he also, this is very important, aside from maybe sucking on Winston, he really wasn't that bad, but aside from maybe not being good enough on Winston, he also felt like the atmosphere of the team started to become negative after the break. Essentially, he felt like, because they were losing all of their scrims and losing all these contenders teams, that it kind of evolved into a blame game in a way. They weren't good enough on Monkey, they weren't playing Sombra, and they were starting to find faults in each other because of their terrible scrim results. And he does believe, even though nothing was verbally said, that the team around him thought badly of him, and apparently he thought bad of them as well. And, he brings up a very good point here. Once that trust kind of falls apart between you and your teammates, you're going to start losing. You need to be just totally locked in with each other to really play up to your maximum potential. And he knows he's part of the problem, but at the time he really does think that he was doing well. And I have to agree with him. I do think Winston was one of the more underlying issues with Charge, and that they could use someone that's a bit better on this role, but he wasn't terrible. Not by any means. Obviously, the fundamental Sombra issue has been their biggest issue. And it's because of all that stuff building up that the Charge got really frustrated, the atmosphere changed, and they just weren't trusting each other anymore. And it's really eye-opening. It goes to show why they're having such a poor start, and why they probably lost a Panthera as well. They're just losing all of their scrims right now, even to the contenders teams. That explains a lot. Like, if we had known about this behind the scenes, none of us would have been picking the Charge the last couple of weeks to win any kind of game. Like, that's really, really bad if you're struggling to even beat the contenders teams. And in Piggy's eyes, he's kind of salty, which I can't really blame him for because it feels like he's getting blamed. Like, he thinks Gaga's Winston's really good. He's, confident he can do well for them, but he doesn't exactly want them to win. Like, he doesn't really care that much, which is hilarious to me. But yeah, that's kind of what happened, essentially. That's Piggy's explanation as to why he thinks the charge situation has gotten so bad, why he left the team as well, why they're not playing well right now. There's a bunch of other interesting stuff that he talks about in here that I will leave a link to again if you want to check out the full thing. But that kind of helps explain, if he's really being honest here, if he really has an idea of what's going on, why the charge are not doing very well right now, and why their season is basically derailing at the worst possible moment. Like, I can't believe how fast they peaked, And the first couple of weeks of this season, they were the best team in the East. But then they lose to Infernal, and they start to go down this downward trend, and then suddenly they lose to the Spark. And then they end up losing to Dreamers, and they just never recovered from that. I don't know what went wrong, but, they just lost that confidence. They lost that trust in each other, as Piggy said, and they couldn't play the Sombra. They weren't very flexible. It all kind of adds up in the end, and it's led to one of the quickest peaks we have seen in recent memory, really. I feel super bad for Piggy that this had to happen. It was a cool little comeback arc for him to be on the charge. It's just a shame that things had to end this way, and the team got so frustrated and apparently started blaming each other, not necessarily verbally, but it's what they were thinking. It's really unfortunate both for him and for Choice A1 as well. Genuinely, I want this guy to be in a global tournament so badly. Western fans deserve to watch this guy play. He'd probably gain such a big fan base if more people watched him, but it's just never going to happen in this current situation. The Charge seem like they're cooked right now, and I don't know if there's any end in sight. It's super duper sad, but we can only hope they can turn it around before it's too late. Aside from that, I probably think it's good for us to move into the Spark and Dynasty. Another pretty surprising result here that comes right off the tail end of ditching Lee Soo-min and signing Vindame to the main roster. So the Dynasty went out there and stunned the Hangzhou Spark, and also, as we'll talk about later, lost to O2 Blast. So they stunned one team, get stunned by the other. Pretty wild week for sure, but it started off pretty good. Started off on a high note. They beat the Hangzhou Spark, one of the best teams in the East. A lot of people would argue the second best team up until recently. So now we start to ask ourselves, is the support change the key to success for them? Because they definitely look a lot more confident and comfortable out there. It could just be them benefiting from some changes temporarily, but at least right now here in the present, they seem a lot happier. Because Prophet was playing like a madman. This is like the most confident he's looked all season in my eyes, even in the loss to O2. I mean, even Belos Rhea was looking a little bit better out there. Not perfect, but he was making some decent clutches on that Winston and on that Wrecking Ball. I mean, that clutch on Oasis, match point, your down percentage, it seems like the Spark are going to take this series, and then Belos Rhea goes out there and he basically replicates what he did in the Soul Infernal series, right? It's pretty much the same exact thing, if I can pull it up here. I don't know if I can find it. I'm going to kind of look through super quick, but it was basically the same thing that happened in the Infernal series, right? Where it seems like they're losing. I mean, it's without the Doomfist, but Spark are down, or Spark are up members, Dynasty are losing, it feels like. But then Belos Rhea comes in, and right at the brink of death, down 3 members here, Vindame, Krillin, and Prophet, easy on EMPs, and Belos Rhea just gets Primal, and he starts annihilating everything to turn this fight. Literally the exact same place, on Oasis Gardens, like we saw against Infernal in week 1 of this season. It's funny how things work. It's funny how he always manages to do those things, right? It's pretty crazy. But, yeah. This ended up being a pretty epic game. My expectations weren't very high coming into it. I thought maybe Dynasty could take a map, but they ended up taking 3, which is really, really sick. And they looked great out there. They looked confident. It wasn't perfect like we saw in Numbani and Dorado, but there were some pretty awesome moments. Prophet was playing like a madman, like I said, and more specifically, Vindame seemed to have been the key here, as they not just look super happy and a lot more motivated, but a lot more organized as well, I'd say. Krillin and Vindame may end up being a pretty good, balanced support line. Nothing out of this world, but for East standards, it may actually be enough. Vindame plays super aggressively. kind of like with Lee Min, but on the main support role, and Toby just knows how to enable that, I guess. And Krillin plays a lot more reserved at the same time compared to Lee Min. There's like a notable difference between his Ana and Lee Min's. You could tell there's just a difference in the positioning and what he's looking at. He's more of a team player, and that's kind of what Seoul are looking for, just knowing where the playmakers are on this team. And Vin Dame, he just might be a better fit on Dynasty, like I was saying. It's just a good scheme fit in Toby's system, maybe compared to Krusty, and I'm glad to see him looking a lot more alive and alert. However, with the good news also came some bad news, like I was preluding to before. Losing to O2 Blast. Not something that any of us were expecting, I'd say, even though Dynasty have been pretty inconsistent. Like, this is a tough loss that shows they certainly have some work to do. It was really close. They almost brought this back, but Seoul fans, you may not be back yet. A lot of you were starting to ask, maybe, there's a chance to catch up to some of these top East teams. Maybe beating the Spark is a sign of things to come. But as it turns out, they ain't quite there. They aren't quite there yet. Like, you're never going to be able to compete with Dallas or Infernal in your current state if you're losing to O2 Blast. There's just no world where you should ever be losing to a contenders team like this, especially after beating Hangzhou Spark. I just don't understand it. Like, Dynasty have been such a weird team this year. They don't make any sense how they can have such high highs and low lows at the same time. This consistency needs to be solved, as it's giving me heavy flashbacks to 2020, and I do not want to see a repeat of that. It's just really sucky, man. Like, especially because they lost in front of their home crowd. And it's there where you'd almost expect them to have an advantage. They looked like the veterans on LAN against Infernal, And Prophet is so used to dominating in these scenarios, so it should be nothing for him. Even Krillin has a lot of experience here. But they let Who Are You and PH, also known as Prophet, compete in a meta that just doesn't suit them on paper. They were not punishing that lack of Sombra at all. They should know that's what the weakness is because they had PH before. That was their guy. They should know exactly where they should take advantage, but they could not. PH could literally do whatever he wanted to on his comfort sniper and hit scan picks, and he ended up getting a solid revenge win after getting dropped. It was the most satisfactory outcome possible for this guy, and now Dynasty fans are probably so pissed that this guy played so well the moment that he got dropped, and then he beat your team of all teams. And also, just the fact that Who Are You did so well against Prophet in a Tracer battle definitely caught me off guard. Maybe it's a sign that he's improving. Maybe it's a sign that Dynasty weren't focusing him enough. I don't really know. But Who Are You played pretty good in this one. And if we're being real, O2 also proved to be more flexible, as I've been talking about constantly throughout this entire video, with a lot of these other matchups with upsets and big games. It always seems like the more flexible team is the one that's winning right now, as the Ramatra comps from O2 Blast were giving Dynasty serious problems, and they just could not keep up. They desperately swapped to like Wrecking Ball and to Genji and stuff like that. And I just don't think that making those desperation swaps is the key. It goes to show you can't play what you need to win. So, yeah. Like, we saw how well that worked for the Shock amongst other teams. You're just not in a good place if you do that. The Dynasty right now, though, have some big-time consistency issues they have to work through if they want to turn their season around, be competitive, and maybe make a late-season playoff push. Because right now, you're not beating Dallas, and you're not beating Infernal if you can't beat contenders teams. And I don't even know if you beat Spark in a rematch, just knowing how weird they can be at times, and how sometimes they just get super cold during qualifiers and then play well when it matters. I don't know if Dynasty really have a chance at this if they don't continue to improve. They've got to pull through and not lose the gimme games to show us that they have a chance. They have a fighting chance. It's already not looking good for them, but this is just not a good sign. Like, they showed flashes that you're looking for, especially with quick swaps like this, but it's safe to say that right now, sorry Seoul fans, your team is not quite back yet. Excuse me. It's tough though, man. It's tough. I like this Dynasty team. I want to see them do well. But right now, they are not. And honestly, this doesn't even just apply to them or like the Charge in terms of these weird struggles and inconsistencies. If we're being real, every team not named Dallas or Infernal right now have not been looking very consistent. They've all shown weakness. They've all shown they're just not ready for some of these contenders teams, amongst others. This is exactly why, though, the East ends up not getting as much respect compared to the West. You'd expect teams like this not to be losing to O2 Blast and to Panthera. It's just a very bad look, and it shows that you're not going to be able to compete with these Western teams if this is like the capabilities that you're currently showing, if these are your limitations. Most teams are just fumbling to teams that they should not in the East right now. And the best team in the East isn't even top 4 in the West, that being Seoul Infernal. Just think of all the teams straight up losing right now in the games that they shouldn't, and not playing well in others and looking super sloppy. It just makes the East not that impressive. It shows that they have a long way to go and that they're the weaker overall region. Yeah, it makes things a lot more spicy. It's definitely entertaining, but from the standpoint of making a playoff run and being a respectable team, people have zero reason to care for them in that regard. Their rosters are worse, their skill cap is worse, their teamwork is worse, and the fundamentals aren't as strong either. And of course, because they're playing in a weaker region with less reliable scrim partners, they're not getting as good of practice either. And one team in the East, at most, I think is probably going to be capable of going on a run. And that's if they get lucky, you know, if the schedule and the stars align, if the meta aligns in their favor. Maybe like Infernal, for example, or Dallas could do what Spark did in 2022, but they're going to be underdogs that probably don't make it to the finals regardless. Really, for the East, in terms of competing at the highest level, I feel like the only hope at this point is that the playoff meta and the new game mode and the new hero shake things up just enough to make the ground a lot more equal between the East and the West. I'm hoping the East can make some sort of comeback and things can go their way and they can start to be more respectable. But right now, they serve as nothing more than temporary entertainment value, as none of them realistically will go on a run, sadly. As for the future, we'll see what happens, but that's kind of my stance right now, and what I'm looking to see as we close out the season in the East. And from there, now we can take a look at ATP's Performers of the Week. And starting on support, I'm going to be going with my guy, Shu. If I can pull it up here. I did not come prepared for this, sadly. I can get it up in a second, but I went with Shu, like I kind of mentioned before, for what he did in the Atlanta series, clutching up as hard as he did when his team needed it the most, finally outplaying his rival fielder in a huge game that gives the Outlaws the confidence boost they need to potentially end up winning the finals as we head towards the end of this season. If you can beat Atlanta Reign, you can beat anyone. So having this type of inspirational performance and having your hard work pay off is going to pay massive dividends for the Houston Outlaws for the rest of the season. And you can count on that. Unless the playoff meta absolutely screws them, they're looking real good with highlights like this coming out of Shu. He was fragging on the Kiriko. He was fragging on the Ana. He was fragging on the BAP. I mean, he absolutely bap-gapped. That's fun to say. Bap-gapped our guy Fielder in that one. Not totally Fielder's fault, but yeah, I mean, look at these Ana stats. It really doesn't get that much better than that. 10k healing per 10. You know, the Bionades and the Slapes were on target. I think there was like one map in particular. I don't remember which one it was, but it was like a stupid Ana gap. Maybe it was Dorado. I can't recall, but Shu was just absolutely outplaying his opponent in that regard. Moving on from support, my DPS, or excuse me, not my DPS, tank first. My tank player of the week is going to be our boy Chatty for what he did against San Francisco Shock and what he did against LA Valiant. This guy was playing like a Chad all weekend long. Maybe he wasn't the most dominant tank compared to some of these other players, but bro, it made a difference. Just nothing but pure confidence and Chad-like energy coming out of this guy. He was a god amongst men. It was a huge team effort for sure, but I think Hottie was the spearhead with this kind of play. London played better as you see him teabagging when their leader looks confident and he's chatting his way out into spawn and doing whatever the hell he wants, really. This is the way that Reinhardt should be played. With zero hesitation, with zero fear of the enemy, shattering in the spawn, getting random pin kills, throwing out those fire strikes to the sky and getting a rip tire. Like that's the kind of stuff that inspires you to play better. That's how Rein should be played. That is the honorable and Chad-like way to play this character. He was an absolute god and the leader that London needed to get this win, to get 2 wins for that matter, and possibly turn their season around. And for being that leader and for being that motivation, being that guy the rest of the team can look up to, I believe that he deserves the tank of the week. And speaking of being a leader and, helping his team play at a higher level, my DPS player of the week has to go to none other than Proper. I don't know why I said Profit. It has to go to Proper. Even though one game came in a losing effort and the other one was just enough to beat a Valiant team that they shouldn't be having to go 5 maps against, I feel like with how he played, he deserves to get some credit. Maybe it's mostly out of pity. Maybe I mostly feel bad for the guy. But he deserves credit for literally popping the hell off in both series and, doing everything he could to keep the shock in these games. Without him, they are not winning Gibraltar against London, and they're probably not winning the series against Valiant. They may even get swept for the Valiant for all I know. That's how much of a difference this guy makes. He was everywhere, doing it on everything. The Tracer, the Sojourn, Pharah, Junkrat. Super flexible, always playing at his best. I mean, these Valiant stats, what else can you really say, right? Almost 12 final blows per 10. Almost 3/4 of your pulse bombs being hit every 10 minutes. Dude was doing everything he could. He played with his heart out, despite knowing that the odds are heavily stacked against him. What else could you possibly do when you're getting 3 5Ks against London and still losing? This guy is carrying basically a hopeless situation. And it's probably one of the hardest carries of, from one single player that we've seen in years, if not ever. This guy's putting out masterclasses just to survive maps and extend a series. And I really do appreciate his unwavering determination to strive for greatness, despite knowing what's stacked up against him right now. And that is why he's going to get my DPS performer of the week. And with that in mind, there's 2 other things I wanted to cover before I wrap up today's podcast. One actually doesn't have to do with the games, and instead is a pretty insightful video/podcast. You may know the 4 Horsemen with Monte Cristo, Thorin, and Richard Lewis. I know that, the reputations, it depends on who you're talking to with them. I'm maybe not the biggest fan of some of these guys, I guess, but that's not the point here. What is the point, though, is this was a very insightful episode that talked about some of the shortcomings and makings of the Overwatch League. And, obviously they talked about, why it's not doing well, what happens if it dies, but this was really, really, really insightful and interesting to listen to. I'll leave a link to this in the description as well because, there's some pretty juicy details. They even have Harsh on there, former Vancouver and Outlaws coach. There's some pretty interesting information unveiled that I had no idea about in this, and I wanted to share some of it with you because a lot of this stuff, while it didn't happen, is just mind-blowing to me. So, OWL, first off, according to Monty, was originally supposed to be, right from the start, a traveling road show. Essentially, it was like the original plan that we saw in Season 3, but right at the beginning, and instead of the teams hosting these events, I think it was more so the league renting out different venues per week. I don't know the exact specifics there, but that's what he made it sound like. So basically, they'd go all around America and, attract a lot of fans from a variety of locations and markets. Instead of just being stuck in the Blizzard arena every week and having your audience slowly but surely shrink, it can help keep with that engagement and really farm it and get a lot of fans interested in Overwatch League, whether they've played the game or if they're just casual. The Blizzard arena was not the original plan. I mean, the league itself was supposed to start in 2017, but they ended up delaying it for 1 season. But they ended up flip-flopping with this plan of going to Blizzard Arena instead for the first 2 years because they were trying to figure out the production quality, apparently. In Monty's words, they were trying to, get it consistent before risking it with different crews and venues every single week because you don't want to mess this up and have problems in such a professional setting. It's just not a good look. But by doing this, they kind of tapped out the market they could reach because they were just in LA, which hurt in the long run, of course. And Monty actually didn't sign up for this originally. I mean, he obviously wanted to be a part of the league, but when he signed his contract, he did not sign with the intent of having to live in LA. He actually signed up because of the road show. That's what he was more interested in. He found that very fun from some of the pre-OWL stuff, traveling to different countries and stuff. He thought it was great, the attendance was great, the viewership was great, it was a lot of fun. But he ended up having to live in LA for several years because of this. It kind of screwed him over. He got stuck there not just for the tenure of the league that he was there, but also In the present, he's still living there, and he's just now recently preparing to move. He had no interest in being there, and he kind of got screwed over because of the league. So as you can see, right from the start, there was a lot of turmoil and shakings going on and just big problems, indecisiveness, not knowing what to do, taking risks in places that they shouldn't. And Monty, I believe, said that he thinks part of it is them not wanting to upset Bobby Kotick, who a lot of you, of course, are going to have strong opinions on, me as well. We won't get into that, though. But the point is, though, they didn't want to return to the boss man, so to speak, and say, oh, we should change this, we should change that. Hey, this thing that we're investing all this money into, maybe we shouldn't do it. Nobody wanted to upset him, and that ended up causing more problems that could have been avoided. In the words of Monty, he said it was like being on the Titanic, essentially. Like, you could see the iceberg, but you weren't going to be turning around. It was coming right for you because, the format that they had with this whole rotating roadshow ended up not being very good right from the start. In his words, the league probably would have died out a bit faster if we had stuck with this original plan, because it was just expending too much time and resources and valuable money, of course. And in the words of Harshell, like I was saying before, the former coach of the Outlaws and the Titans, he was saying he thinks the league would have actually been over after 2020. Like, he and Monty both firmly believe that COVID's actually the thing that saved the league and prolonged it, if anything. A lot of people talk about how LAN would have been so great, and this is the thing that killed the league. It killed off the hype. But in actuality, the more I think about it, the more I see stuff like this, COVID actually may have saved our butts from having this league die by like 2020. Monty said it was like watching the iceberg, but it ended up melting right before it got to us on the Titanic. And Harsha believes that everyone would have gotten burnt out if 2020 stayed how it was and we stayed with that model, because there was just way too much traveling. Everybody was getting sick all the time. Apparently his guys all got strep throat like twice each during their road trip during like those first 4 weeks where there were a lot of homestands during 2020. It was pretty bad. Like, some of his guys couldn't even play. Like, he couldn't even bring them with him to that homestand because it just was too risky, too dangerous. And this was before the pandemic as well. Like, they were all getting super duper sick. Their immune systems were in shambles. And, they were playing away from home like 4-5 days a week because they were on the road like a bunch of weeks in a row. They got screwed over with the schedule, constantly flying, living in an airplane, living in hotels, not being at home, not having a proper place to practice as well, or much time to practice or prepare for it all. Like, it's no good. It's not like IRL sports where you have those state-of-the-art facilities, These teams have it a lot rougher. When you're away from home, you can't really practice, you're super sick, and there's just no hope for you. It's just exhausting. And he himself, Harsha that is, said that he probably would have retired on the spot during 2020 if things continued the way they were. And he feels a lot of his players would be inclined to agree with him. And that makes me think maybe a lot of other players from different teams also would have joined him. So maybe COVID actually wasn't that bad after all for the league itself. Obviously, COVID sucks, but for the league and its health, it may have been the best thing possible just because of the very ambitious model that we decided to go after. Well, not we, but they decided to go after when forming this league to begin with. And also, on top of that, not just player burnout, you have to think about it financially. I was talking about the resources, and I really mean it. Like, you have to rent out a venue. You have the cost of production as well, which is very professional production, by the way, for these types of events. And you have to rent out a space for all of the different teams to practice in the facility. That's a lot to do. That is rough. Like, in Harsha's words, we're talking like 600, 700, 800,000, $1 million losses per homestand. And as we know, a bunch of these teams had multiple homestands that year. Like, didn't the Justice have 2 in like 6 weeks or whatever it was? Like, that's exactly what I mean. Harsha believes OWL might have died right there if things continued as they were. So COVID, in a way, was a blessing in disguise for the Overwatch League. And he's definitely right, I think. All this stuff combined is just absolutely insane. Just knowing what's going on behind the scenes and how it probably could have been avoided if they changed some stuff up with the fundamentals. Like, we really might have dodged a bullet in the end. It's sad, of course, not to have the lands, But the health of the league in the end is more important in terms of watching many, many seasons like we've seen. We've had 2021, 2022, and 2023 since the COVID thing happened. So yeah, maybe we got 3 extra years out of the league, if not more potentially, because of what ended up going down in the shift in models. And that's not even where it ends. This Monty stuff is really, really intriguing, and same with Harsha. But I believe it was Richard Lewis who brought up some big-time dirt, and juice, I should say. Because apparently Overwatch League, and I found this fascinating because I've had this what-if scenario happen in one of my videos before, but apparently the Overwatch League originally wanted to have a draft system like the NFL and NBA do, amongst others. It would be very similar to like drafting a college player into a professional league. They had that idea. That was something they were thinking about doing, maybe to potentially appeal to like more of like the traditional sports audience. I don't really know what the thought process was behind it, but this was something they thought about doing, and it's something that a lot of us have probably thought about as a what if before, but it really almost happened. It's just that the orgs would be required to cancel out those contracts with those players that they already had on their teams, by the way, and that's just not realistic. Like that's just a little too crazy. A lot of owners were already bought into the league. They'd already purchased their franchise spot, so you'd be asking for a lot of renegotiations, and you'd have to also add in some protections, which of course Blizzard wouldn't want to do. Why would they want to protect anybody? But like, for example, a players union would have been required, and that's something we've talked about a lot in the past, how we don't have one of those. That's been brought up since day one. The players have always found that pretty crazy. And they might have actually had one if there was a draft system, but OWL really did not want to go down that route. So yeah, we ended up almost having a draft and some super different looking teams potentially. Like really, who knows what could have happened if something like this ends up going through? How much different could history have been with this kind of system, where all these players get separated? A team like the Shock building their foundation for the future. Maybe something like that never happens. Who knows what the landscape and the history of this league looks like? Maybe Shanghai Dragons wouldn't have gone 0-40. Maybe Boston don't go 10-0 in that first season. Maybe NYXL don't win like 1 billion games. Maybe London Spitfire never go on their grand finals run, amongst other things, in future seasons. Like, legends could have been spread thick and thin everywhere, and I don't even want to imagine how different things could have been if that goes down. But ultimately, they pulled the plug on this idea, like I was saying before. It's a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation to have, I guess I should say, because it's something I've thought about multiple times in the past. Like I said, I've even made a video on this. Definitely check it out if you haven't already. But it's interesting to think about what may have happened if this ended up going through. Let me know your thoughts about that down in the comment section, because I found that pretty insane. I can't help but wonder what could have changed if it actually did go through. I think the only other thing I wanted to bring up in this very lengthy podcast, which again, you can check out through the link in the description, is actually on Bobby Kotick himself. Apparently, he kind of screwed over the league in a way before it even started. I mean, not that much, but he was very limiting in who could actually get a franchise spot, apparently. Like, when they were in the process of getting owners to sign up, he was very particular. Him and his group, I should say, were very particular with who they wanted. They wanted to go a lot more traditional with major American companies, especially tied to sports. They wanted big-time, rich sports owners, like we see with the Boston Uprising and the LA Gladiators and the Vancouver Titans. That was their target market. That's what they were looking for. They wanted these big companies and sports orgs and billionaire owners to invest in their league and potentially sponsor it. And at the very least, show how to successfully run events so then they could also make a profit. The people around Bobby Kotick were telling these other interested high-level esports owners, mind you, essentially to F off. Like, they only wanted the well-established billionaire people and other people that were just super rich. Like, they were saying no to some well-established, experienced orgs, even in, like, LCS and stuff. Like, these guys know what they're doing in esports, and maybe they could have helped. Like, they didn't even give them a chance, though. They didn't even make the cut. Like, they were asked, why aren't you going for the Overwatch League? And they said, it's probably because we don't know if we're going to get in. Which sounds ridiculous, because, again, they're, like, well-established esports orgs. But that's how it was. That's what Bobby and his group were looking for when establishing this league. A lot of the ownership groups that they wanted were the big guns. And guess what? Those big guns that they initially wanted, some of them are dipping out and aren't even committed, like we saw with LA Gladiators. They're dipping. Even if OWL didn't die this year, there were serious questions on if the Glads were going to stay in the league. They may have been the next Chengdu Hunters for all we know. So yeah, even before we knew about all of this stuff going on with the league dying and with Chengdu going out and maybe Gladiators, Bobby and his group were apparently already doing some really selfish and shady and just bizarre things behind the scenes. Like, they're not investing in the esports side of esports. They're getting other people who don't know esports into their worlds, which in theory can work, but it doesn't make sense to have so many of them, I feel like. Maybe a better mix would have been good, but I just don't like how limiting they were with this decision process. It just doesn't make any sense. Maybe we could have had some better ownership for some of these teams, and they could have been ran a bit more smoothly. Maybe, that is. Maybe. I don't know for certain, but like it's just a thought, right? It's just a what-if theory at the end of the day, I suppose. But point is, though, Bobby Kotick and his group were pretty involved with Overwatch League as well and making some pretty weird decisions. And they refused to change their minds on a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of shady doings going on over there. But this idea of going away from the people who know esports, in my eyes, was just really silly. And that's all I really have to say there. So now to end the podcast, I definitely want to look into the future and what it holds, as we usually do here. So heading into week numero 3, trace, if you will, of Overwatch League 2023 Summer Stage, we've got some potential bangers in the works here. Soul Inferno versus Dallas Fuel. That could, oh, where did it go? Oh, I'm clicking away from it. This game could be pretty big. These are like the two best teams in the East right now. It's a good way of measuring where Dallas currently stand. It's a good way to show if Infernal truly are the overlords of the East once and for all, as it stands right now. LA Gladiators versus London Spitfire could be a big one. Gladiators have to show that they can bounce back. London Spitfire, meanwhile, are trying to continue that win streak. Atlanta Reign are going to play Florida and Boston this week on, back-to-back days? So that's a pretty brutal schedule. Look out for them. Look out for Florida and Boston potentially leveling up. Guangzhou are going to try and bounce back. That'll be fun to monitor. Titans and Justice could be pretty even. There's some pretty good-looking games coming up this week. We have a potential Toilet Bowl in the making, I believe. Vegas and the Valiant. That's going to be interesting. You feel like Valiant should win that, but you never really know. Regardless, I'm just hoping for some chaos. But yeah, the games are looking pretty satisfying. There's a lot of evenly matched matchups potentially on the horizon with some of these mid-tier teams all going up against each other. Atlanta schedule, Dallas Infernal. It's going to be another fun week, and I would not be surprised if we once again get some pretty shocking results, but I guess we'll see soon enough. But I think that's just about going to do it for this one, ladies and gentlemen. That's going to do it for episode 8 of the This Week in Overwatch League podcast. If you enjoyed, I would appreciate it so much if you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up to date with all of my most recent podcast episodes and other Overwatch League content. And of course, let me know what you think about all of this interesting information about Overwatch League behind the scenes and the matches down in the comments below. I've been ATP, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.